There we go. Okay, that one's turned on.
They're all too above my pay grade.
And so Vince says, yeah, let's use two in case you... yeah, the light's on. That's the main thing. And
Okay.
mic is on this end, so I'll just switch it. Okay.
Do they pick up
Yeah, they should
pretty
pick
well
up.
so I can lean
Yes.
back without
Yes.
any concern?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Fire.
All right, here you go. So your last name is Sullivan.
It is.
Could you tell me a little bit about how your family got to here and your
Sure.
roots in Ireland?
On my mother's side, which they were Hamiltons, they were Irish as well. But her family was in the railroad, worked with the railroad. Her grandfather was an engineer, and her father ended up to be an engineer for the Union Pacific. My mother was born in Evanston, and then moved. When I was a kid, my grandfather was working in Torrington for the railroad, head of the roundhouse in Torrington. And so I don't know exactly how they came over. They were here before I learned about them. And but I did meet relatives in Ireland from their time in Ireland. They lived in the Midlands in Longford, County Longford, and then on my father's side, they were County Cork from Ireland. And my great-grandfather came over during the tail end of the potato famine and was a miner in the Beara Peninsula in Cork. And the copper or whatever they were mining there, I think it was copper, ran out. So they all came over, not all, a number of them. He came over as a young man and went to the iron mines in Michigan. And then a man named O'Neill, Colonel, I think it was John O'Neill, who was from the Civil War and a zealot of Ireland, who attacked Canada 3 times to remove the Queen from
the Fenians, right?
Yeah, that's right. And he ended up ultimately getting thrown in jail, and finally, I think, decided that was a lost cause, so gave it up. But he ended up going to the iron mines in Michigan and encouraging the iron miners said, "You're not being treated any better here than you were in Ireland. They're giving away land in the West. Follow me." So they called them the Michiganders, and they went to O'Neill, Nebraska, and formed O'Neill in the late 1800s, or I'm not sure exactly when they got there. All I have it in my information because I met in Ireland an American lady who grew up in O'Neill and whose grandfather was great-grandfather was one of the Michiganders, which was kind of fun. But so he was a farmer in O'Neill and had 7 or 8 children. My grandfather was one of those, and then my grandfather graduated from Creighton Law School and came to Wyoming. First came to Casper. He was in Casper for a year or two, about 1900, and then went to Laramie to practice law. And so my father was born in Laramie, my mother in Evanston, and they met at the university, but my dad went off to work for the Federal Land Bank, and later that was the only place he could get a job in the early 30s. And then later my mother went off and worked for the Federal Land Bank, not following him because they weren't dating until they got to Omaha.
Oh, I see.
And they were married in Omaha, and my older brother and I were born in Omaha. It's the one big cross that I've borne all my life. Everyone in my family is born in Wyoming but me. So in the Centennial, when I was governor, I was the only one in my family that couldn't get a native Wyoming button.
I didn't know that. Well, that's interesting, yeah. I should say before we get any farther into this, I'm sitting here with former Governor Mike Sullivan here in Casper. It's the 8th of January, 2019. My name's Tom Ray. I'm the editor of WyoHistory.org, and we're asking Mike today about his Irish connections. And
and my time in Ireland as ambassador.
As U.S. ambassador to Ireland after he was governor of Wyoming. So as you were growing up, did you have a feeling about Ireland? Was it something your family talked about much? It's fairly far back for you.
It's an interesting question,
yeah.
which I've contemplated a lot, because I did and I didn't. My dad used to sing some Irish songs, and we always were happy on St. Patrick's Day, but we weren't what I call professional Irish.
Right.
We were proud of it, but we didn't spend a lot of time on it, nor did I learn a lot about it, nor I didn't learn until later in life my grandparents' travels and how they got here. That wasn't something we talked a lot about. I think there was more Irish in Laramie when we visited my grandparents in Laramie, and it was their family, my grandfather and grandmother were more sort of traditional Irish and big breakfasts, and my grandfather never drove a car. My grandmother drove him around, and he came home, put on his smoking jacket, and she waited on him. So I think that's more traditional Irish. Anyway, so it was there, but it wasn't there, and none of my family. I had an aunt on my mother's side and an aunt on my father's side, his sister, who went to Ireland while I was sometime between growing up and adulthood. So, but other. You
mean they moved there? Or they traveled there?
Well, actually, my dad's sister ended up living in Ireland for a couple of years because she was married to a guy who worked for Marathon, and they were working for Marathon in Scotland and Ireland. But there was nobody in the family really went back to Ireland, or there wasn't any particular need, or it wasn't on the top of anyone's priority. So it was a part of our lives, but not a priority or significant part. Yet, when I ultimately went to Ireland, and as I matured and learned more both about Ireland and Irish people, I started realizing that all of the old couples that my parents sort of helped along the way, and my dad, who was a lawyer in Douglas, represented and took care of the widows and so on, and the same in Laramie, the O'Flanagans and the Coughlins and so on. They were all Irish. So there was a much higher presence than I appreciated as a young man, because they were taken care of the Irish and concerned, and their friends, at least the ones that they were helping. I mean, they had lots of friends that weren't Irish, but there were always, as I learned when I started looking at the pubs in Ireland, the names of the pubs, the O'Learys and those kinds of names that I really didn't connect up as Irish. And so it was an important part of my parents' lives.
Yeah, and I think of there being longtime Irish communities in Wyoming, a lot of them sheep ranching families, Ellis's and Tobin's.
And more of a presence here in Casper than otherwise. And that's, the Mackins and the O'Learys and the Collins and others were sort of isolated instances. They didn't really have the community because Douglas, where I grew up, wasn't that big a community. But here, I think it was more of a community of Irish, and it probably would have occurred to me earlier. In fact, just as an aside, when I got to Ireland, and I'd never been to Ireland before, and had no particular connection with my family apart from what I learned from my aunts. But because I was from Casper, Wyoming, at that point in time, the Sheepshead Peninsula, which is sort of the center of the Casper Irish in County Cork, assumed that I was a part of the Sullivans from Casper, which I wasn't. I was happy to take credit for being a part of them, but I wasn't. And yet the Barra Peninsula, which is the next peninsula north of the Sheepshead Peninsula, knew from some background that I was really a Barra Sullivan. And so that created a little bit of competition between the two. And I didn't ever try to claim both, but I took advantage of both because they were still cousins of the Murphys and the Sullivans and the Ellises and others that came from the Sheepshead Peninsula. There were a lot of relatives there. There weren't many. I wasn't able to trace direct relatives, except I was related to everybody on Barra, as near as I could tell. But I got the benefit of being connected with both, and that added to the pleasure of the experience.
Okay, so you served as governor from 1980, must have been 87 through 93.
95.
Right? Oh yeah, okay.
Actually, January of 95.
Right.
The inauguration was yesterday here, and I think it was the 6th of January when I went out as governor.
And then you ran for the Senate 2 years later?
No, I ran for the Senate
4 years
the
later.
year that I was retiring as governor. So I ran in 86. Not 86. 94.
Okay. Right.
And
all right. And you lost to Craig Thomas.
Right. Lost to Craig Thomas.
And then so how did the Clinton appointment of you as U.S. ambassador come about?
Well, Bill Clinton and I were very good friends. We served as governors together and served on the executive committee of the National Governors Association together. And I had great respect and admiration for him, and had told him one time that I said, "When are you going to run for president?" We were having a cocktail after a dinner in Washington. I said, "When are you going to run?" He said, "I don't know." But everybody knew he was going to run. And I said, "Well, when you run, let me know. I'll be happy to support you." Well, as it turned out, that was in about, that was 90 or something when we had that conversation. Or it was a little before, it was before that, I guess. Anyway, when he decided to run in 90, I think it was 90, he was elected in 90. So.
He was elected in 92.
Yeah,
right?
Okay,
right.
That's probably right. Okay,
right.
He started, anyway, he called, said, "Remember our conversation?" I said, "I do." He said, "I'm going to run." I said, "Don't you think it's a little early?" Because nobody anticipated that he would win that election. He said, "Well, I understand it's probably early, but I think there's a potential there." And so I said, "Well, I told you that was the case. I'm ready to support you." So I did support him.
I remember that. I remember you coming out and endorsing him
first
well
governor.
Before the convention, and before the primaries were settled. Yeah,
he needed some credible support, and I said, "I don't think I'm that credible. We're just a small state out here. You're not going to gain a lot of electoral votes by my endorsement." But no, I said no. So he flew out to Cheyenne and Kathy Carpin, then Secretary of State, and I endorsed him. And so fast forward, he was elected. I was defeated. I was out as governor. He wanted me to come to Washington and do something. And I said, "No, I don't think I want to go to Washington." I mean, I agreed to run for the Senate, but I wasn't totally devastated by not getting to go to Washington as a senator. I don't diminish the job or the fact that I would have enjoyed doing it, but I thought, well, we'll go back to practice law. I wasn't a politician to begin with, and I'll be happy to go back and be a lawyer again. Anyway, I said, but if an ambassadorial position comes up where they speak English, because I don't speak anything else, the Vatican or New Zealand or Ireland, I'd be happy to consider doing something like that. Well, the Vatican did come up, and he ended up appointing Cokie Roberts' mother, who was a congresswoman whose husband had been killed in an airplane crash. And so that didn't happen. And then Ireland came up again because Jean Kennedy Smith, President Kennedy's sister, who had been there for 5 years, her time, 5 years is a long time for a political appointee to be in, but she was a special political appointee.
Yeah.
So it was open, and I knew it was, but I didn't ever talk to anybody because I thought, it's one of the prime appointments, and the people in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and Boston were lining up for it. So I didn't anticipate that I had any potential, so I never raised it. So I'm sitting in my office here in Casper one day, and the phone rings, and it's the White House, and they said, Governor Sullivan, there's an opening in Ireland for an ambassador. And I said, I understand that. And she said, well, your name's on the list. And I said, oh, I didn't know that. And she said, it doesn't fall off. It doesn't seem to fall off. And we thought we better find out whether you had any interest before it went any further. And I said, well, I can tell you right now I have an interest, but I can't make that decision until I talk to my wife, Jane. She's just sort of getting her roots back. This is 3 years after we'd gotten out of the governor's office. And I couldn't make that decision without talking to her. Let me call you back tomorrow. So I went home, and I knew I was going to have to approach this carefully. So we had dinner, and we were having a glass of wine out on the deck. It was a nice early summer evening. And finally Jane said, how was your day? And I said, oh, it was interesting. She says, what do you mean? Well, I said, how would you like to go to Ireland? And she said, on vacation? And I said, no, I got a call from the White House. She said, and you waited 4 hours to tell me this? So we talked about it, and she said, yeah, it would be interesting. And so I called back and said yes, and then waited, and the nomination came ultimately, and then it almost ran out of steam because the opposing impeachment.
Oh, right then.
It was running into, well, two things. One, I took a physical for the appointment, found out I had heart disease and had to have a 5-way bypass.
Oh my gosh.
In August.
So this was 1998?
1998, yeah. This is just 20 years ago. So in August I had the surgery. At that point the paperwork was in pretty much, but it wasn't going anywhere, partly because of politics and partly because of the pending impeachment, and everybody was distracted. But I got the surgery done, and I think 2.5 weeks after the surgery, I went to Washington to see if I could do something about getting the paperwork moving, because I figured if I stayed, well, two things. One, I was in limbo in my law practice. And two, if I stayed around too long and impeachment went through, I'd never get to Ireland.
Right.
I thought, yeah, I'll at least get there and enjoy that. And so when I got there, they said, well, we have an agreement with Congress with the House the Senate, that there will be no more hearings on ambassadorial appointments before they go out at the end of the year.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, I want to get as far as I can get.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as it turned out, being from Wyoming has its special benefits
Mm-hmm.
because the congressional delegation, all Republican, were very supportive and pleased for my appointment. So Liz Brimmer, who was on Craig Thomas's staff, arranged to get me a spot in the last hearing before the Senate went out, and that was going to be held, much to the consternation of the State Department, because you're not supposed to be dealing with
directly with the Senate, without
delegation or Congress, without having all of the T's crossed and the I's dotted. And but she did it. It wasn't because I was imposing it. She did it. And so she said, "You get the paperwork done, and they agreed to have the hearing." So we got it done and had the hearing, and I think it was one of the last actions the Senate took following the hearing was to approve 3 appointments. There were 3 of us who went through.
So this would have been late
same
fall,
hearing
maybe even
as-
after the election.
This was in
98.
this in October,
Okay.
November, and so then I went the 1st of January of 1999, and my first stop was in New York to try to introduce myself to the sort of professional Irish in New York, because they didn't understand why somebody from Wyoming got this appointment. There weren't any real Irishmen in New York, and so Jane and I were there for 3 or 4 days before we went to Ireland, and had a lovely time meeting some wonderful people in New York who finally decided, okay,
he'll be
maybe
okay.
he is an Irishman.
That's really interesting. Okay. So you were there then. So you were in Dublin around the early January. Mid-January.
Shortly after the first of the year.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
So we finally got to Ireland.
Yeah, no, that's
after all
good. No, this
time.
is really interesting. I've been reading a lot about the troubles in the politics, and so. But before we talk about that, tell me a little more about what you found there and what your job really was, and what Jane's job really was.
Well, what we found there was that the position and the accommodations were about as good as it gets. The position, being ambassador to Ireland from the United States, puts you at an extremely high profile and a high level of acceptance in Ireland because of the unique relationship between the United States and Ireland over so many years, and so many cousins and relatives in the United States, and the impact that emigration to the United States from Ireland had on Ireland during its most difficult times. Many have heard about letters from home, or letters to home, from people that came over and established themselves and were successful ultimately through some difficult times, but ultimately successful in the United States, and they sent money home to the extent that at one time, for a period of time, there was a budgetary line in the Irish national budget that was Letters from America or something to that effect, because it had enough of an impact on the domestic product in Ireland that it warranted being carried in the budget. So that the U.S. ambassador was something. And having followed Jean Kennedy Smith, everybody was saying, okay, who's this guy? I mean, she was pretty special. And so and the U.S., because of its influence, and the U.S. ambassador, not because of the personality, but because of the office, occupied, some people said, like the third highest profile in
the Republic.
Ireland. Whether that's true or not, I suppose is debatable, but that plus the U.S. ambassador's residence was situate in Phoenix Park, which is the largest walled park in Europe.
Didn't know it had a wall around it.
Yeah, it has a wall around the whole thing, and I think it's 1,200 acres or something. And there are two houses. Basically, there are some caretakers' houses, but there are two houses: the President of Ireland and the U.S. ambassador. And they were both built by the British, and our house was built in 1776. And for the British
Viceroy,
yeah. And so you couldn't have had better circumstances. And it was was beyond any ability I had to even think about having ever been in a position like that.
So you had a staff?
We had a staff. We had a butler, head butler, assistant butler, two cooks, 2 or 3 people on the grounds, and an additional couple people taking care of the house.
And the U.S. Embassy staff also in Dublin, right? How
the
big?
U.S. Embassy was situated across town, and it had a staff of about 125, as I recall, mostly Irish, about 100 Irish and 25 U.S.
State Department people.
And we had a good staff on both ends. So the circumstances were hard to beat.
Yeah.
And then the work, which we'll get into, I expect, was significant enough to make it a very satisfying and intense. I mean, it wasn't as intense as being governor, but it was real work, as distinguished from some ambassadorial positions where you really don't have to work. Now, the beauty of it is, I suppose if you didn't want to work, you wouldn't really have to. You had plenty of staff at the embassy. There were expectations, of course, but you could adjust your work level at pretty much 2 or 3 different levels from top to bottom.
Was there sort of a chief of staff at the embassy, or somebody who had been there a long time and knew the ropes?
Yes, there's a deputy. I lose track of the State Department names, but there's a deputy who, in the absence of the ambassador, is the charge d'affaires and is in charge of the embassy and takes that. And when I got there, he had been in that position for some time and was in charge for probably about 6 months before I got there. And then there was a press affairs person, a economic advisor, a political advisor. The Commerce Department had a representative there. The Defense Department had a representative. We had a representative of the agency there as well.
Which agency?
CIA.
Oh, that agency. Okay.
And so it was good.
Oh, okay. So, and when you got there, so early 1999. So the Good Friday Accords had been signed, I think, in the spring of 1997, and then there was referendums.
98.
98.
Yeah.
Okay, that's right. Okay.
They were about 6 months. The Good Friday Agreement was about 6 months from having been signed.
Okay.
It was signed on Good Friday of 98.
Right. Right. And there was still then a referendum on it yet to come, or
I don't remember whether the referendum was before I got there or after I got
Okay.
there, but it was pretty well signed and sealed
Right.
by the time I got there.
right.
The challenge in it became, though, probably the next to the safety of Americans, which the ambassadors always, that would be the first
Uh-huh.
priority, would be safety of Americans in the country that you're stationed. That's the embassy's first and foremost assignment. The Good Friday Agreement and its implications were probably the most responsible issue that we had
Uh-huh.
to deal with.
Uh-huh.
And that was, if, as you would know from knowing something about the Good Friday Agreement, it was signed, but it wasn't stable.
Right.
And so the assignment we had was to try to make sure the parties held it together and do whatever we could to assure that was the case. So we were, and even though I was in the Republic and Northern Ireland and Belfast were under the jurisdiction of the British, the ambassador to Great Britain, the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, we were still involved in the process, and because of the Republic, so through the government of Ireland and through the fact the British ambassador in Ireland had both assignments.
The UK ambassador to the Republic.
Yes, to the Republic. He had the whole island, so he was deeply involved with it, and I ended up doing a lot of business with him.
What was his name?
Ivor Roberts.
Okay.
And he's now Sir Ivor Roberts. He's a really talented career diplomat from the UK, and we became very close friends. And I ended up doing things in the North, but you were always, with the exception of Jean Kennedy Smith, she figured she could do whatever she wanted. She had a little bit of a little tension between Jean Kennedy Smith and the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, because she didn't really pay attention to whose jurisdiction it was. She just went when she wanted to. Well, it was anticipated that you'd clear it. If I was going to Belfast, I'd call the British ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Britain, and clear that. And at that time, his name was Phil Lader. We had a good relationship, so it didn't cause any trouble. We went a couple of times together, but that was always a kind of a balancing act. But so we were dealing with the Republic of Ireland, the political parties in Northern Ireland, and Sinn Féin, who was the political arm of the former IRA,
right,
in Northern Ireland and in the Republic, and so it was a challenging and enjoyable experience.
Yeah, and I just read a big fat book on the Troubles by a former journalist named Tim Pat Coogan.
Tim
Did you ever
Pat
meet
Coogan.
him?
I did. I had lunch with him a couple of
Uh-huh.
times. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
He was bigger than life.
I bet he was. Very good.
He was.
The book's this fat, and
Yeah,
I felt
I have
like
it.
I felt like he'd written it all off the top of his head, kind of. But but
Well, that's the kind of guy he was.
Right.
He was a big boisterous Irishman.
Right. Well, he talks in that book about, he kind of describes the moving towards talks in the late 80s and early 90s as really having been made this kind of a long time vicious stalemate, having in a way been broken by American influence that kind of came to that had a lot to do with Jean Kennedy Smith and her Kennedy connections, but also
He was a
with
very
the
close
Clinton.
friend of hers as
Yeah.
well. And it did, and it came about through intervention both of the government, the U.S. government, and private interests. There were a number of people whom I dealt with and worked with regularly that had been coming over to try to work with all of the parties.
Americans.
Yes,
Yeah.
Americans, to work with all of the parties to encourage them and so on. And I think that reached its zenith when they wanted to give Jerry Adams a visa.
Right.
And Jean Kennedy Smith was active in that, and there was a lot of resistance to that politically in the U.S. just because of the IRA background, the terrorist background. And Jean Kennedy Smith and President Clinton and these Don Keogh, who was there were two guys. One was president of Mutual of America, and then his successor, who's Tom Moran, that I just learned passed away a few months ago, who became a very close friend of mine. They had been coming over. They might come over on a monthly basis, sometimes more often than that, and they'd go to Belfast and work with people there, and then come down and report to the government. And so there was a lot of private interests that helped along the way.
Yeah, Coogan talks about a guy named O'Dowd, an American.
Yeah,
I think-
Niall O'Dowd.
Right.
He has the Irish American magazine,
Uh-huh.
and those were all people that most of them we met when we were in New York when we were there. Niall O'Dowd and Tom Moran and others, and they were very, very important in the.
What about George Mitchell? Was he still over there?
He was, and of course from the official side, he was the best of the best, and was still doing the same. He was trying to make sure it stayed together too.
Former U.S. Senator from Maine, right? Who was
and
who Clinton had appointed to as a kind of a head of a commission to help with the talks.
He was appointed as the representative for the U.S. to try to help facilitate the Good Friday, what became the Good Friday Agreement, and worked for years with ultimate patience. He was a former federal judge as well as U.S. Senator, and in my opinion, maybe the most impressive politician I've ever met, as well as having more patience than any other politician I've ever met. He, for years, he was sitting around and talking to both sides who weren't talking to each other. They were just talking through him, and but he persisted and was successful. But then it got almost as difficult afterwards, as they were trying to figure out how to maintain this, and everybody was making demands, and largely the demands were for the IRA and its associates to give up their arms.
Right.
And so we were working on that.
Right, that whole question of, do you have to give up your arms before we can talk? Well, no. Well, then when?
Yeah, when?
Yeah.
and that was, in fact, they hadn't quite given them up when I left, I don't think, but it was shortly after that that they did figure out the process by which they get that done.
Yeah.
And we were working, another person that we worked closely with, and I worked closely with, was the president of Ireland, who was Mary McAleese at the time, and that's a constitutional position. So the prime minister is the chief sort of political position, but she has I'm missing the word now as to how you describe it. She has the constitutional position and is
sort of analogous to the Queen in the English Constitution, right?
It's that kind of
or the President of France.
Some ultimate parliamentary responsibility, and constitutional responsibility. The rest of it is pretty much representational. But she was a person who wasn't necessarily content just to be representational. She was a former law professor from Belfast, and so she was deeply involved. And I worked, and this is an aside. Her husband, who was a dentist, ended up becoming deeply involved in the relationships between the North and the South, and we worked together on that a lot. And I attribute a lot of credit to him. Not in the same sense as George Mitchell, but he was working down here with the
because they had Belfast connections, but they were Catholics, I suppose, if they were in the Republic. And right. So doesn't the Good Friday Accord set up new sort of North-South, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland
bodies,
institutions and committees and bodies that weren't there before? Is that right?
And formalized some that were there before, and set up a new government that was representational from both sides, and that was difficult to put together. And they're still having their difficulties. It's not a cakewalk at the present time.
It's such a so Ireland has 32 counties. 6 of them are Northern Ireland. The traditional Ulster actually had 9 counties, but the 6 counties with a strong Protestant majority at the time were set up to continue as a province of the UK after World War I, when the rest of Ireland split off from the British Empire. And always then you had this sort of impossible, it seemed to me, political problem where the mostly Catholic people in Northern Ireland felt themselves as Irish. The mostly Protestant people in Northern Ireland felt themselves as British. At the time of the partition, the majority was probably 2-1 or maybe larger of Protestant to Catholic. By 1990 or so, it was coming a lot closer to
that was
even. Isn't that true?
Yes, and I think there were two things. Well, more than two. It'd be oversimplifying it, but that sort of moved it into a position where you could ultimately get some kind of agreement, because it was an impossible situation. It was a majority minority, clearly, and the majority had no concern about whether they were abusing the rights of the minority or anything else. And as I always said, one of the problems in Europe that we don't have here, nearly to the degree, is they carry the cross of history on their backs. And it's not a short history, it's a 300 or 400 year history, and it's even greater than that in other areas in Europe. But they're all looking back to what happened 300 years ago and saying, well, this is whether it's the potato famine or whatever else. And so that makes it much more difficult. But two of the things that were happening then, one was what you just pointed out, is that the numbers were changing. The Irish Catholics in the North were starting to move to a point where they were ultimately going to become the majority, and that was clear demographically, and that caused everybody to start thinking, well, we ought to plan for this. The second thing is that the hard men, the fighters, were getting older, and they weren't being replaced by that many, and that was on both sides, because there were bad guys on both sides of the issue, and so that was pretty clear. They were getting tired of fighting, and then a very, I think, strong influence was the combination of Bertie Ahern, who was the Prime Minister of Ireland, Bill Clinton, and Tony Blair, and all three of them, and I think the fact that Clinton was willing to step out, stick his neck out, and say, "I'm going to take this on as an issue," which he was recommended that he not do that it was too sensitive and it was a loser. He said, "No, I think we can help get this done," and that made a big difference.
And also the flip in the British government from John Major to Tony Blair. Coogan talks a lot. Coogan, who finished his book before, after the first IRA ceasefire, but before the agreement, talks about how as Major's power in Parliament, as his majority was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, he had to depend more and more on the Protestant Irish, Northern Ireland, to maintain his majority, so he kept making sort of concessions to them that would set the process back another 3 months or 6 months, and then finally he was, they had a general election, he was voted out, Tony Blair.
Yeah, and I always said, in fact, as we were dealing with how do you get the IRA to give up their arms,
right?
I was meeting with Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, just
those are the main
to encourage
political IRA,
get
Sinn
this
Féin,
done. You guys, for your grandchildren and your children, you need to get this done. And I always said to them, the stars have crossed. You've got Blair and Clinton and Bertie all working on this, and that's a unique time, a unique opportunity. Do it. You just got to do this. Well, they were. One thing I learned along with the cross of history that I mentioned earlier, these guys were in for the long game. They weren't going. Instant gratification didn't matter to them. They had, every time I talked to them, I thought this is a great big waste of time. They know exactly where they're going, but they were very courteous, and ultimately all of that pressure helped move them. But they were very strategic,
and they probably had some pretty tricky politics on their other flank.
Oh, sure. They were. I mean, you've got to say this
on
about
the Republican side,
both
Irish Republicans,
both McGuinness and Jerry Adams. They were hugely courageous because they put not only their political reputations but their lives on the line, and they were all the time having to bring the people and the hard men along, and with a lot of resistance.
Yeah. What about on the Unionist side? Did you ever meet Ian Paisley?
I did meet Ian Paisley, and I met most of the leaders on the Unionist side. I didn't spend a lot of time with
Trimble.
Them,
It's kind of.
I did. David Trimble. I had a number of meetings with Trimble, and
he was the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland.
He was the leader at that time.
Yeah.
And John Hume on the Republic.
Yeah, sort of
side.
the nationalist.
He was he and Trimble were the two major leaders at the time when I got there, and some of that changed while I was there. But it was very interesting.
Yeah.
And there were some of the leaders of the lesser Northern Irish parties that were impactful in getting some things done. And then Mo McGuinness, was it Mo McGuinness? Mo.
I don't know who that is.
She was a lady who was appointed to handle Northern Ireland, and ultimately she was there, and then she died after I left, I think. But she was
She was a British
effective.
representative?
Yeah, she
Okay.
was British. And a real character. But it was very interesting.
And meanwhile, the big Orange Marches were continuing every July
They were continuing.
while you were there?
I never saw an Orange March, but there wasn't a place for an American ambassador to be found, I don't think. But they were continuing, and that was one of the additional efforts, along with the arms.
Okay. It's interesting that so the arms was the thing. The question of decommissioning, of disarming, was still trailing out long after the agreement. Yeah. And on both sides, I suppose, right? Is that right?
Yeah, but the and that was all part of the argument. But the major issue was the IRA's their disarmament. And it, I think the key was they were never going to really turn them over. They may decommission, but they weren't going to give them to the British. And so the secret sauce had to be, okay, how do you do that and confirm to everybody that they have in fact decommissioned them,
right?
And that they're not just saying that.
And Mitchell played a role in that, right?
Mitchell was deeply involved, and he was back and forth, and we met him a lot. He stayed with us a couple of times, and that's where I developed such a great respect. I had it anyway. I liked him when before he ever got to that point. The other, just as an aside, you were talking about the bodies that were developed as a result of the agreement. Mitchell was appointed initially by Clinton as the U.S.'s economic advisor to Northern Ireland, to try to help with the economy, and as a part of developing the economy, reach an agreement that would ultimately hold. Then when Clinton decided to put both feet into the fray, he moved Mitchell to the peace process as peace advisor, and appointed a man named Jim Lyons, who ultimately became my law partner. Jim was from Denver, and he took Mitchell's place as economic advisor about the time, it's probably 2 or 3 years before I got to Ireland, and he was a guy I had known because I faced him in a couple of lawsuits, and then he was on Clinton's. He traveled with Clinton for a year during the campaign.
Okay.
He took it off because he had the same respect. Anyway, he was appointed as the economic advisor, so he had the position of the same level ambassador, but it was only a half-time position. He continued to practice law in Denver, and then he'd go off to Ireland. It was an intense thing. But so he was another one of those people that I worked with, and we became friends. And ultimately, when I came back from Ireland, his firm set up an office here, and I went to work for them. So he was, and so he was deeply involved in the peace process as well, with the economic arrow.
So that was so he was a State Department person, and so he was helping to bring American companies to invest in the north or along the border, both
developing programs, and was a part of I forget what they called it. May have been the Northern Irish Economic Council or something like that. It was a combination of Irish and American interests. And so there were a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
But we were talking about decommissioning.
Yeah.
And one of the secret sauce as to how you get it done, and ultimately, in discussions that we had, the recommendation, and I'm not sure now ultimately how it rolled out, because it rolled out after I left, but was the idea that you'd find a priest that could go out with the IRA and attest to the fact that the arms had been decommissioned.
And did that mean put in a hole in the ground, or did it mean dumped in the sea, or did it mean walked away from?
It meant any number of things. Mostly, maybe put a hole in the ground encased in concrete or something like that, that would assure that they'd never be used again, but that nobody would know where they were, and that was the.
So that was the one thing everybody could agree to, was that Father somebody goes out.
Well, I'm not sure how. That was a proposal when I left. It was still in the discussion stages.
Were there still any bombs going off while you were there?
No, not really.
The
last one, Omaha, I think was before I got there.
Yeah.
But not that long.
Yeah.
And
right, that was a huge one. That was after the accord had been signed.
Yeah.
Right.
And but it was pretty quiet. And everybody said, "Oh, aren't you afraid to go to Northern Ireland?" And by that point, there wasn't any reason to be fearful about it.
Did you have security with you when you went places?
When I went to Northern Ireland, once I crossed the border, I had security. In the Republic, I didn't have security, except at the residence. At the gate, there were guards, and they patrolled the boundaries. We had 70 acres, and so that was the extent of security. I did not travel with security, and we had the Marines at the embassy, but they were there to take care of the embassy paperwork and the classified materials. They weren't so necessarily. They would, of course, taken care of the ambassador too, but that wasn't their primary responsibility. But if I went to Northern Ireland, we would pick up security at the border.
Were those Northern Irish policemen? Were they?
No, they were Northern Irish police. Yeah. Yeah.
How many times did you go, do you think?
Oh, probably 10 or 12.
Oh, yeah, a lot.
And the most memorable one was when I went with the British ambassador, and we had really good security then.
Yeah.
Because it was both of us, and he needed to have. I mean, they killed a British ambassador in Northern Ireland, so they always had big security for him. But we got into a Northern Irish police car, and there was one ahead of us and one behind us, and we whipped up that divided highway at about 100 miles an hour, and it was pretty impressive security.
Yeah.
Now, after I left, 9/11 occurred shortly after I left, and that occasioned additional security. The ambassador now travels with security wherever he goes.
Oh. Did you get to go around the island much?
We did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I loved it. Jane and I traveled a lot. We traveled a little in Europe, but mostly in Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And it was great. Jane used to say, Mike didn't know he was ambassador, he thought he was governor. But we did a lot. And that was a part of the two sides, of course, are the responsibility with the peace process and safety of Americans and commerce, facilitating U.S. business in the Republic. All of those are the meat of the job.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the representational side, which it takes just about as much or more time. So
mm-hmm.
we were on the go a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And visiting different places and giving speeches in small towns and large towns.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was great.
It's nice. I spent a month in Ireland in 1972, hitchhiking around with a friend of mine, and I've always wanted to go back.
I'm envious.
We were mostly just misbehaving and not hurting.
Yeah, but it's a great place to do that or anything else, as far as I'm concerned, because people are so friendly.
Yeah, they were. They were very friendly. So I also think of ambassadorships as being sort of having a lot of dinner parties. Were you? Was that part of the deal?
That's
kind of?
the representational side.
Uh-huh.
And we did. There was a ballroom in the residence where we could have a large dinner and a large dining room, and so you could have a medium-sized dinner or a large dinner, either one. And we had plenty. And that, you asked early on, we've never gotten there, what Jane's job was.
Yeah.
Well, Jane had no job officially.
Right.
But there were expectations.
Right.
She ran the house, did the bookkeeping, kept track of our expenditures and the things we had to do on our own and then get reimbursed for, and do things like dinners and entertainment of many different kinds. The biggest event at any embassy, U.S. embassy throughout the world, is July 4th.
I see.
And that's a big celebration where the ambassador has a July 4th party and invites government representatives and private representatives and people you know and have run into, and so it was a great time, and everybody enjoyed it. We did a Western theme each year, and I guess we only did two, but we had a great time and enjoyed it a lot, and people enjoyed it. And the other one which we enjoyed particularly was Thanksgiving. We always had what I'd call a mid-sized dinner, maybe 30 or 40 people for Thanksgiving dinner. And because nobody in another country is used to
taking that Thursday off
or celebrating Thanksgiving, they didn't know anything about it. And well, do we bring gifts? Well, what do we do? We said, no, you just come and you eat, and we give thanks.
That's
and
nice.
So it was a great.
So those weren't just Americans in Dublin. Those were
No,
all
we
kinds
invited Americans in Dublin, but we also invited people from outside of Dublin that we'd met, couples that we'd met, and it was always.
Do they have turkeys in Ireland?
Well, we were able to get turkeys through the commissary in London. The embassy would be able to secure secure that. But they don't have. Well, you couldn't buy turkey you'd want to eat
Mm-hmm.
in Ireland. I don't think. Somebody could, I suppose, but we wouldn't have found.
Mm-hmm.
But it was always fun.
And did you think of using, or I guess that's fair, using those social engagements as ways to get people connected who might not otherwise have been?
Absolutely.
And you needed to.
Yeah.
That's sort of.
And then I had private breakfasts and lunches at the residence as well, with representatives from various places.
What about the
From
press?
various organizations.
Did you have much connection with the Irish press?
I did have a good bit.
Uh-huh.
I wouldn't say on a regular basis, except when I'd be places the same press people. It would be like here,
Right.
and we had a press officer who dealt directly with the press, more directly than I did, but I did, and I'd have lunch with press from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the Irish press.
Yeah. I'd like to read those more. Yeah.
The Irish newspapers you could just spend your life reading Irish newspapers because they're so literate and fun.
Were there British reporters too in Dublin, I suppose, or were they?
There were, but I didn't have any.
Nobody seems to.
I didn't have much connection with them. Then from a dinner, from the representational side as well, we would, if any other embassy was having like equivalent of July 4th or their Nation's Day, we would be invited there and other things as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it was.
And this English connection too reminds me of one other thing so when Coogan in this book is talking about the late 80s and the early 90s and how maybe it was after Clinton was elected, there was NSC staff was really more sympathetic to the nationalist Republican side in Ireland than the U.S. State Department was, which some people described as Brits with American accents. And I wondered if some of that might have still been true when you got there, if you ever felt that the U.S. State Department was more sympathetic with the UK point of view in this whole dispute than maybe Clinton had brought into the question.
Well, I think it probably had been fairly well leveled by the time we got there, but if you think about it, it wouldn't be surprising because the British embassy is of such higher level of both budget and importance economically
in Washington
than would be the Irish, and unless you had this sort of uniquely Irish contact or background, you wouldn't think much about Ireland. You wouldn't necessarily know.
If you were an American politician in Washington.
Yeah. If you were in the State Department or in the bureaucracy.
Right.
If you weren't an Irishman, well, those dollars don't mean that much. But when we were there were over 600 U.S. companies doing business in Ireland. It was at the peak of the economic cycle that they went through, and so it had a lot of different attractions. It was attractive from an economic standpoint. It was sort of a stopping over place as congressional delegations, anytime they went that direction, they'd usually stop in Ireland on the way back. And that's another part of what we did in the economic and commerce side of things. We had congressional delegations that came through. We had trade delegations that came through and the companies were all, they had big staffs and lots of employees in Ireland, so they'd have their own unique events. So there was a lot to do. And then, you know, there was the good part. Golf is a part of the business in Ireland, so I got to play a lot of golf and participate in events associated with companies or events associated with Americans that related to golf. So that was a great and enjoyable part of it.
And then about the border, it was still a border with gates that came down and people stopped you and asked to see your passport when you were there?
By the time I got there, that was probably one of the first things from the Good Friday Agreement was to get rid of the hard border. And so it was, I don't think maybe early on I may have gone through a checkpoint, but I don't think there were still towers at the border, but there were, when they stopping, it was pretty free.
And that's made it much easier to do business, I'm sure, especially for people on those border counties.
Therein lies one of the big difficulties with Brexit currently as to, okay, how are we going to handle this? And nobody associated with the issues in Northern Ireland and the Republic want a hard border, because that just brings back all of the old issues.
And also it looks to me like Theresa May's in a very similar political position to what John Major was at the end of his time, which was she needs those Northern Ireland MPs to keep her majority, and so she makes stuff to keep them happy instead of concessions. So that seems to be really dangerous. So,
and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to that.
Could be terrible, actually.
It'll be a real setback if it got messy. So.
Okay. What was your favorite place in Ireland? Did you Are there any places you got especially fond of?
We got especially fond of a lot of places. And people asked me that question, and a lot of Irish said before we left, well, you're going to buy a place over here, aren't you? And I said, no, it's a long way from home to start with. And two, I wouldn't want to have a place which I'd have to go to, because I like too many places in Ireland. And so it'd be hard for me to pick out my favorite places. We spent a good bit of time with a couple named Denny and Mary McGuire, who were Americans that lived in Kinsale for 6 months of the year.
Where's that?
It's in Cork, southeast Cork, on the ocean. It's a lovely town, and Denny McGuire had been an orthopedic surgeon in Sheridan, whom we didn't know when we went over there. But as we were leaving, everybody told us, "Well, you got to meet the McGuires. They're over there 6 months," and we did, and they became good friends. And so when we needed an escape, we'd go that direction. And we found another farmhouse, sort of hospitality in that same general area that we love to just disappear to. We didn't do that often, but 3 or 4 times we ended up going down, and the food was great. There wasn't any.
Imagine that, good food in Ireland.
Yeah, well, and that's where it transferred from when you were there. And the whole, Ireland was always viewed as, well, it's a nice place, but the food is sure awful. But by the time we got there, that had all changed, didn't it? They had really good food, great fresh fish, and so it was much more hospitable in that regard than it had been in the past.
Yeah, it's where I learned to eat blood sausage and other things like that.
I did as well.
Blood pudding, they call it.
Yeah,
That's
blood
right.
pudding,
Yeah.
black and white. But their eating habits hadn't changed much. They didn't start until 9 or 10 o'clock, and that took some getting used to.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you been back since?
Well, we left in June, I think, of 2002.
2002? Okay.
Yeah. Well, no, 2001.
Mm-hmm.
So we were there 2.5 years. And I ended up with about 2 or 3 months additional because of Dick Cheney being in the White House. I said, everybody had to give their, when the Bush administration took over, you were advised, we expect your resignation of political appointees. And the date you will terminate is like April 1st. And I ended up having a conversation with Cheney during that time. I said, leave me here as long as you can. I wrote him a letter.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, Dick, I think it's nuts that when the administrations change, all of a sudden these political appointees just get terminated. It doesn't do anything for the position.
Right,
Because
to have
it emphasizes
empty,
the fact that you're a political hack.
Right.
And by that time, it doesn't take you long when you're over there for you to recognize you're representing the country. This isn't a political position. This is a privilege to be a representative of the country, and we ought to be doing whatever we can to enhance the authority of the position. And the authority of the position isn't enhanced by being ceremoniously removed when the administration changes. And in any event, ultimately for that and for other reasons, I said to Dick, leave me as long as you can. I like it here. And, we haven't been home. Well, we went home, we came home Christmas before that because we knew we'd be coming back. We had some things we had to get done, but we hadn't been home. We hadn't been to the United States except for St. Patrick's Day, when everybody in the official Ireland comes to the U.S. And goes to Congress. And, yeah, it's a wonderful. And the Prime Minister presents a shamrock to the President. And everybody celebrates St. Patrick's Day in Washington. But, so we ended up being in Ireland for an additional 2 or 3 months longer than we otherwise would have. And then we came home.
And who succeeded you in that position?
I was succeeded by Richard Egan, who was the chairman and founder of EMC Corporation. And
I don't know that company.
it was a Boston, Massachusetts technology company, I think, and he made a huge amount of money. In fact, he brought his plane and his wife brought her plane when they came to Ireland. And he didn't last long. It turned out he didn't particularly like the job. Well, he was a corporate CEO and had his own company, so I think he'd been in charge. And the fact is, you're not in charge over there in the sense that you are delivering the policies and messages of the administration, and you're expected to do that. And so he wasn't particularly happy. I think he was there a year maybe, and then he was succeeded by a man named Tom Foley, who's also from Boston, I think, who was succeeded. No, there was Tom Kenny, who was from Chicago, then Tom Foley, and then Dan Rooney, who was the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Yeah, I should know that.
And in fact, I used to tell people after I got back it was worth going to Ireland just to meet Nan Rooney, because he was one of those professional Irishmen that came over, helped with peace process and other things there. Was revered in Ireland, and so he was there a number of times when we were there, and I got to meet both he and his family. He was a remarkable guy.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm out of questions. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you want to tell me about this?
No. It doesn't have to do with this, but it's probably worth it, since this is oral history, to have it in history somewhere. It goes back to my conversations with Dick Cheney.
Uh-huh.
I got a call in November, I think, when we were in Ireland. President Bush was going to be the new president. Cheney was going to be vice president.
Uh-huh.
And he called and said, "We're looking at cabinet positions. Would you be interested in being Secretary of the Interior?"
They did.
And I said, "Oh, I don't know."
Jeez, Mike.
Geez, Dick, that would be saying we can have a lot of fun. And so I said, "Well, I don't know. I don't know that it makes a lot of sense. I'm the wrong party." And well, he said, we need a Democrat or two in the cabinet. I said, "Well, I'll talk." He said, "Are you coming back?" And I said, "Well, in fact, we're coming back for Christmas. That's the first time we'll have been back."
Uh-huh.
He said, "Well, come down and talk to us. We'll make arrangements." So we flew in Christmas and arrived on one day. We were about 3 or 4 days ahead of Christmas. And the next day, I went out and jet met me, got in, flew to Austin, went to the, I don't know, this residence, the Capitol building. It was downtown. I think it was the Capitol, but it may have been the residence. And visited with Andrew Card and Cheney about the job. And I said, "Well, I'd have an interest, but I want to, if you're really serious, I want to check with some Democrats in Washington to know that, I don't want to be a man without an island. I want to know that I can have some bipartisan support if I'm doing the job." And I've met a number of people in the course of this job that I have confidence in and like to talk to. So I can't tell you now. Well, we'd like to have you do it now. And so then they went out and brought Bush in, and he said, "Just say yes." And I said, "Mr. President, I can't do that. I need to have more support." And so then we came back, and interestingly enough, before I really ultimately made the decision, it got into some of the local Republicans. And
here in Casper,
in Wyoming.
In Wyoming,
and
yeah.
They raised hell, and so it went.
I mean, they were horrified that they would appoint a Democrat like you.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah.
It was. I would have had some friends as well, and it would have been. I think arguably you could argue it would be good for Wyoming. But some of the real high conservative.
Can you tell me who those people might have been?
No, I wouldn't do that, but you can guess. Objected, and so it kind of went. But in Cheney's book, he makes reference to it.
Okay.
And he said he gave me. He did a nice job for me. He said he turned us down. But.
And I forgot who was the first Secretary of the Interior.
She was former Attorney General from Colorado, Gail Norton.
Oh, okay, right.
And so anyway, it was It was interesting.
That's an interesting moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rather interior secretary.
As I looked at it afterwards, I was glad
Glad that it came out that way.
that it came out that way, because I think it would have been an impossible position. The secretary, under the best of circumstances, is going to be a controversial position, and to not be
to be uncertain with the Senate, especially
sort of be under suspect by both sides.
Yeah.
It would be tough.
Yeah.
So. There you have it. That's all I can think of.
Okay.
Although there was, I had close connections with, and I was reminded because part of the people I called Ted Kennedy, Chris Dodd, and some others.
And had you gotten to know them some as ambassador?
Yes.
More, yeah.
Yeah, and they were very close to the Irish government and all of the issues. So when I went back for my hearing and for other things in Washington, I visited with them and asked for their support of my nomination. And Pat Leahy was another one that was deeply involved with Ireland. So, but that was fun. In fact, I'm cleaning, as I mentioned. I think I'm trying to get moved out of my office downtown. I was looking through some stuff, and I found a note from Jerry Adams that said he'd finally gotten a Stetson. He wanted me to know that. And I had some pictures of, it was just before we left, John McCain and Chris Dodd and the actor from Tennessee, or whoever it was, Fred Thompson, came over on a trip to Ireland, and we were actually having a final big party where the president, who had become close friends of ours, Mary McAleese, was the honored guest, and so they all joined us.
Oh yeah.
But Nancy Pelosi she went through 3 or 4 times. She actually, I think, had a daughter who got married in Ireland while we were there.
She was speaker then?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it was good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great experience.
Must have been
a wonderful privilege.
Yeah.
Just an unbelievable privilege.
Yeah. Great thing. Good.
Okay.
All right. We can push stop now.